Right, so the big news yesterday is that the issues with trade in Northern Ireland might have just been put to bed. And as much as it pains me to admit it, on this rare occasion, God, it's like the verbal version of a hemorrhoid, Sunak might have done a good job. Heartburn. Of course, the first point that needs to be made here is that if the Tories and Boris Johnson had been honest about his oven-ready turkey twizzler of a Brexit deal in 2019, none of this should have been necessary. They said it was done. As Ed Miliband at the time said to Johnson, he hasn't read it. He isn't across his brief. And thus, Britain's laziest ever Prime Minister then sought to undo his deal, making his entire election, based entirely on Brexit, as the 2019 general election was, a complete fraud. Sunak is gloating over what he's managed to achieve here. Well, he might. I'll come on to what he's done presently. But nobody should forget, he, like every other Tory MP there, was elected on the basis that the deal was already done. He voted it through and has now spent about a quarter of an hour in his parliamentary statement on it yesterday, telling us all what a disaster it was. There's no escaping what a hypocrite you've made of yourself here too, Rishi. Anyway, his deal with EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen, what's being called the Windsor Framework, covers quite a lot and does seem to fix a lot of the issues associated with trade and travel of goods between Britain and the EU via Northern Ireland, which has always been a massive sticking point caused by that trade border down the Irish Sea. And although it doesn't solve these issues entirely, it goes well beyond what has been the case previously. I'll go into them in a moment. It's worth picking through them carefully. But as we all remember, leaving the EU meant checks now had to take place at the only land border between Britain and the EU due to the strict nature of EU regulations on such things as food. And of course, it had all introduced much red tape and paperwork, which delayed travel of goods too. Boris Johnson brought in his Northern Ireland Protocol, which basically crapped on the Tories' former DUP allies, said tough luck to them. They were propping up Theresa May's government after the 2017 general election didn't go all her way, don't forget, for £1 billion out of the public purse too, mind. But Johnson left Northern Ireland de facto in the EU, left the DUP and other unionists wailing about it, but legally it all stood up, even if in practice it was a disaster for businesses, complaining all the checks caused delays and additional costs. It was a pig's ear, but it meant there was no hard border, which jeopardised the Good Friday Agreement and risked a return to violence last seen during the Troubles, and it protected the EU single market. Still, the Tories weren't finished with it, though, still tinkering with it. We're planning all sorts of extreme measures to keep playing about with it. And this was the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, essentially, which was being designed to override bits of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's no wonder so much of this confuses people, is it, really? They could have found another name for it. But it risked human rights. It undermined the Good Friday Agreement. It was an ongoing farce that acted contrary to international law. But when you consider it was drafted by Liz Truss to start with, would you really be that surprised? Anyway, first and foremost, that's dead. The Northern Ireland Protocol Bill is dead. What we have instead is the Windsor Framework, and this is what's in it. Firstly, as I mentioned in a video the other day talking about Boris Johnson ditching the option of green routes and red routes of goods travel into Northern Ireland, Sunak has now accepted green lanes and red lanes. Lanes, not routes. Very important distinction, of course, you must understand. But what this basically means is goods intended to travel from Britain to Northern Ireland, but no further, can do so without checks, so-called green lane goods. Anything intended for the EU will be red lane and subject to the appropriate and necessary checks. This puts Northern Ireland in the trade position of being both in the EU and not in the EU, depending on where goods are destined. Schrodinger's Britain, you could call it, I guess. Schrodinger's Ireland, maybe. Both in and out. It's a fudge, but it would work and improve matters for trade, and it means the border in the Irish Sea is gone. Sunak crowed that this would now mean the same food appearing on supermarket shelves in Britain would now appear on supermarket shelves in Northern Ireland. Yeah, so they'll be empty too then. Can they still get tomatoes at the moment, or is that going to end? In all seriousness, though, there were goods we were banned from sending to Northern Ireland under the protocol in case they found their way into the EU under the previous system. There are restrictions on food and that kind of thing. That will now also no longer be the case. All bans are lifted. Chilled sausages are one example. We couldn't send them to Northern Ireland, and now we can, if we have any. Johnson was averse to this idea originally because of cost concerns, he said, over a required new IT oversight system. He was averse to it because it meant work. Oversight system and data sharing was necessary as well. But that has now all been accepted as obviously necessary and will be paid for, because it has to be. So far, so good, so sensible. Parcels heading to Northern Ireland and the EU will not now be subject to full customs declarations. Pets travelling from Britain to Northern Ireland, but no further, will no longer need health certificates, up-to-date rabies inoculations or tapeworm treatment prior to each visit, but will be required to be microchipped. Medicines bound for Northern Ireland will be overseen by the UK regulator now and not the European Medicines Agency anymore. EU rules on VAT will no longer apply in Northern Ireland, but UK VAT rules will now instead. Ursula von der Leyen also apparently surprised Sunak by saying the UK can now have association agreement to join the EU Horizon Research Programme, enabling scientists and researchers in both the EU and UK to begin collaborating again. The UK and EU seem to be officially back on good terms again. On the face of it, you can see Britain, oh God, the heartburn's back. Pains me to say this, but you can see it, being a case of, I've got to say it, taking back control. The most surprising aspect of the whole thing, though, and I still can't quite work out why the EU have agreed to this, although maybe there are, I'll come on to it in a minute, agreed to this, but concerns that this mechanism being called the Stormont break that has been introduced as part of this agreement now as well. Now, because Northern Ireland had been cast adrift to the whims of the EU to all intents and purposes by Boris Johnson's Northern Ireland Protocol, and they had no formal way of influencing rules they were then beholden to, because in that regard they were out of the EU, that's now changing. New powers are being given to the Northern Ireland devolved government at Stormont, where if something comes up that they don't like, they could effectively pull a brake on it. This, if successful, would be a veto to any legislation coming from the EU and wouldn't just affect Northern Ireland, but all 27 member states of the EU. That's mental. It's an incredibly powerful position for Northern Ireland's devolved assembly to be put in. Quite how Sunak pulled this off is flummoxing a few people, and there is a but, it requires very specific criteria to be met, and that might indicate how this became accepted. In order for the brake to be pulled, it would require 30 MLAs, members of the Legislative Assembly in Northern Ireland, from 2 or more separate parties to sign a petition to pull the brake. A 14-day consultation period would then follow, after which, if 30 MLAs still support pulling the brake, it would go to a vote. The vote would only pass if representatives of both nationalist and unionist parties vote for it. It is laid down as not being implementable for trivial reasons, but only for significantly different rules. That's highly subjective, but we'll park it for now. Once such a vote passes, the UK would then tell the EU the brake has been triggered, and whatever the rule change is they were trying to push through would be automatically vetoed, gone. However, only if the UK and EU both agree. So again, there's an element of subjectiveness there, especially since the EU reserves the right to take what has been called remedial measures if Northern Ireland starts diverging significantly from them or trying to. The European Court of Justice also has no oversight over any of this brake business. So it's our courts, our laws, yada, yada, yada. So how has this gone down then? Positively, for the most part, but not entirely. Boris Johnson has, for example, had his widow ego bruised and is already looking to sabotage this. He's apparently urged the DUP, the Northern Ireland Unionists, who have been such a sticking plaster in all of this, to hold fire on backing it. And indeed, this is a significant enough issue that Sunak has gone to Northern Ireland today to have talks on how this would work and why it would be good for Northern Ireland. Being good for Northern Ireland, though, has never been the priority for the DUP. That has always been being treated the same as the rest of the UK. If we're all being kicked in the face, they want to be kicked in the face too. That's the DUP. Their leader, Geoffrey Donaldson, has denied that they've already made their minds up to support the deal. And of course, Johnson is urging them to not rush into it. Pressure from him won't cut it, though. For the Northern Ireland Assembly to have this brand new superpower over EU legislation, they need to get their arses back to work, because the Assembly hasn't been running for coming on for a year now. They want control. Well, they need to get back to work under the power-sharing deal the DUP don't like, because Sinn Féin is bigger than they are now, and they aren't number one anymore. In order to ensure the EU don't inflict rules on them, they might otherwise have been able to unilaterally block. They have a lot of clout here now, potentially. They need to choose to take it. Ultimately, if the DUP still choose to stymie things, whatever happens in Northern Ireland going forward would be on them. Sunak can say, not my fault, you wouldn't take up your new powers that I negotiated, and if the people of Northern Ireland don't like it, well, they also know who to blame and vote accordingly at their earliest opportunity. Will Parliament get a vote on this? Yes, but we don't know when. Many Brexiteers are happy with it. The likes of Steve Baker and David Davies. Others, like Johnson, are not, allegedly considering organising some kind of rebellion against it. Nadine Dorries, unsurprisingly, is also one of those. But Starmer has said Labour will support it, as it seems will the SNP. So it's pretty much guaranteed to pass when it does come. What will upset a large number of Brexiteers is the fact that this deal, this treaty, is subject to the Vienna Convention, which, as an international treaty, a treaty that basically oversees all other treaties between signatory states, a treaty of treaties, if you like. God, this is getting confusing as well, isn't it? It means that Sunak's deal with the EU is governed by international law still, and therefore answerable to the UN ultimately if things go pear-shaped somewhere along the line. Some will bleat about sovereignty over that, but I don't think it'll matter what a few hard-right naysayers say at this point. As for people wanting to rejoin the EU, it's not the answer for you either, though you can argue it's a little bit closer now than what it was. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do hit like and subscribe, leave a comment and hit the notification bell too so you don't miss the next one. Also, look out for me on social media and other interesting stuff by clicking the Linktree link in the comments below, and I will see you next time. Cheers, folks.